and the housing programs that we're going to be discussing today and some of the funding we're going to be discussing. Then we'll go over the findings, all of the things that we learned over the course of this research, and then we'll offer some recommendations for at both the state level and the county level. And we'll, of course, have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So please use the questions box to enter your questions, and we'll compile them at the end and answer as many as we can possibly get through. We record these webinars, and we also post the slides with the recording on our website. We'll do that later today, and we'll also send that out to everyone who registered for the webinar. So if you have to leave early or anything like that, don't worry, you'll receive a copy later today. All right. So let's do some introductions. So again, thanks for joining our webinar. My name is Simone Turek-Lee. I'm with John Burton Advocates for Youth. I'm our Director of Housing and Economic Mobility. And I'm joined today by our Interim Executive Director, Debbie Rauscher. Now, for those of you who know us well, know that our former director, Amy, departed back in October. And so Debbie is our interim director, but she is not new to JBay. For those who don't know Debbie, she's actually been our education director here at JBay for a number of years. And I'm excited today to have her with me on this housing focused webinar, which is new. And but I'm also sad to say that Valerie Kane, who worked so hard on this report and preparing for this webinar, got sick this week and does not have a voice. Every time she tries to talk, she coughs. So that was not an option for her to present on the webinar, but I want to acknowledge her, thank her for all the work she did on this report, and say that she's here with us in spirit. All right. So we're here to talk about a report that we've been working on over the last few months, several months, and it was released today. And Loris, if you're able to put the link to the report in the chat, that would be great. And you can download that today at the URL on the screen. Project 3500, How Two State Programs Expanded Housing for Former Foster Youth in California. All right. So what did we do to, how did we work on this report? You know, really, this was the main component of the report was a survey. So we surveyed county child welfare agencies, and some of you know we've been surveying sort of either transitional housing providers or child welfare agencies pretty much annually since as far back as 2005, 2006, and back when we were founded. And more recently in 2021, we also added federal housing vouchers to this survey to better understand really the full picture of housing for former foster youth in our state. So what we did this year was survey county child welfare agencies. That happened between September and October of last year. And the survey was distributed to 51 of our 58 counties who met at least one of the conditions on the screen. So nearly all of our counties, and really those that had any sizable number of former foster youth living there. We got a 78% response rate, and thanks to everyone who tolerated our stalking of you to get these surveys filled out. For those counties that we didn't receive data from, we requested supplemental information from their transitional housing providers so that at a minimum, we had full data on the number of housing slots and the number of vouchers, even if we didn't get, 100% of the qualitative information we're looking for. We also spoke with a handful of providers and county administrators, 8 from county, 6 from organizations that provided sort of supplemental information regarding successes and challenges, and sort of helped narrate sort of what was behind some of their county's numbers. So why is this report called Project 3500? What is that? What does that mean? What is the significance? We in 2021, we had set a sort of short-term goal of increasing housing support for former foster youth from 2,179 to 3,500 young people. And what that means is that our state would have the ability at a point in time or a moment in time to provide housing support through either transitional housing or housing vouchers to 3,500 young people. And we counties, when we surveyed them back in 2021, had collectively reported an unmet need. And that was really based on what was right in front of them and who was trying to access housing. And so the number that they reported was how we got to 3,500 as our goal. We knew that that wasn't the full need, but it was a short-term goal before we reevaluated and saw, okay, where do we need to go next? And so that's why this is called Project 3,500. And the Walter S. Johnson Foundation, provided a grant to us to pursue, to work on a number of levels, a number of strategies, so that we could reach 3,500 young people as a state, having support for that many young people. And it was a combination of, state and budget, legislative and budget advocacy, and then more recently, some budget defense, a lot of technical assistance to county child welfare agencies, providers, other folks at the local level. We held a community of practice. We're focused on FYI. We've done a lot of ad hoc work. And then, facilitation of local partnerships and planning grants in pursuit of housing development funding like HomeKey, so that not only was there programmatic funding available, but there was actual housing stock available. And then, of course, the development of a bunch of informational materials and webinars. So that's sort of where we come in here and why we're doing this webinar today. We're here now on the other side of things, 2024, have we reached this goal? And I want to also just thank all of our funders that have been super supportive of this goal and super supportive of our work sort of regionally and statewide to try to increase housing capacity for former foster youth. So with that, let's jump into it. We're going to start with just some background on the two programs of focus today, which are the Transitional Housing Program Plus, or THP Plus, as we lovingly call it, and Foster Youth to Independence and Family Unification Program, or FYI/FUP vouchers. It's a mouthful. So we'll start with THP Plus. And just to give you, for those who aren't familiar, and I know many people on the call are familiar with these programs, so bear with us because we want to make sure everyone understands what we're talking about today. THP Plus is a transitional housing program. It's been around for many years, since 2001, actually. And it serves young people now that are between the ages of 18 and 24, so have not yet turned 25. And it's for young people who were in foster care or out-of-home probation placement on or after their 18th birthday. And to be in the program, you have to be working toward your goals in your Transitional Independent Living Plan, or TILP. And you can receive affordable housing and supportive services for up to 36 months under THP Plus, or until you turn 25, whichever comes first. Housing's provided using three housing models. The majority are really with the scattered site, what we call scattered site housing. Single site is the second most common. Host family is fairly uncommon. With scattered site housing, you're really renting, leasing, units throughout the community. Usually as a provider, you're master leasing them usually and subleasing them to young people. So that is the most common housing model. In terms of funding, THP Plus was realigned. It was part of the governor's 2011 realignment of child welfare services. So it's technically been county funded since 2011. So it started out as a state funded program. And in 2011, the funding was realigned to the counties, a total of $34.9 million. And continuing on now, counties still receive whatever their funding level was in 2011. They receive that each year for THP Plus specifically. And most counties administer THP Plus by contracting with nonprofit organizations. Some of the smaller counties do operate it directly, but it's fairly uncommon. So kind of shifting gears here, FYI and FUP vouchers, it's similar to THP Plus in what's provided. It is affordable housing and supportive services, but what's behind it is very different. So again, serves youth 18 up to age 24, so have not yet turned 25, and that has to happen by the time the eligibility determination is made and by the time the housing assistance payment contract is executed. You have to have exited foster care or will exit within 90 days. So this is not only for young people who have already left care or out of home probation, but also that are preparing to transition in the next 3 months. So that's something unique to these voucher programs. And you have to have been homeless or at risk of homelessness at some point between the time you turned 16 and current day. The program provides up to 36 months of housing assistance, and that is what the voucher offers, and it's coupled with supportive services. You can extend your voucher for an additional 24 months, so for a total of 5 years, if you participate in what's called the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, or you do certain participation conditions. FYI and FUP are their federal program administered by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, to public housing authorities in partnership with public child welfare agencies. So the housing authority provides the voucher, the rental subsidy, and the child welfare agency verifies eligibility and provides or secures those supportive services. One thing I want to mention about these programs before we move on is there are 2 different processes for housing authorities, or PHAs, to access vouchers from HUD. There's a competitive way and a non-competitive way. So the competitive way on the left side, you can get both FYI and FUP, which are essentially the same, offering the same thing, just sort of 2 different little sub-programs, through, a notice of funding opportunity, a NOFO, usually once a year, right? So this is a more traditional funding administration process that's, most people are familiar with. And you can apply, housing authorities can apply for a minimum of 3 and a maximum of 75 vouchers, depending on the size of the housing authority's voucher program overall and the identified need of eligible youth. On the right side, this is only available through FYI, and it's new. It became available in 2019. FUP has been around since the 90s. FYI has been around since 2019, 2020. So this new request mechanism came available just more recently. And this is an on-demand, non-competitive request process where vouchers can be requested on a rolling basis throughout the year as eligible youth are identified. And you can request as little as 1 voucher for 1 specific youth, or 25 vouchers for 25 specific youth. And each housing authority can request up to 50 in a fiscal year. So this is, you can use both of these processes to sort of maximize the number of vouchers you have. All right. So lastly, just last bit of background here, the state funding we're talking about today. This is really the funding that was intended to expand what was available at the local level to provide housing support for this population. And the funding goes through the California Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD. There are really 3 programs that HCD provides that they call their TAY programs, right? Their transition age youth programs. The one on the left is called the Transitional Housing Program. And this was really, I mentioned before, THP Plus is funded, the base funding is their THP Plus realignment distribution. But this program, the Transitional Housing Program, was really established to expand what was available in terms of funding for counties providing transitional housing. So, if a county wanted to increase their monthly rate paid to providers to operate the program, or they wanted to expand the number of youth they serve, drawing on the transitional housing program allows them to do that, because their THP Plus realignment distribution is, it is what it is. It's not growing. It's been realigned. It's not going to grow at the state level unless at the local level, a county chooses to invest more. So this $33.3 million on the left is really intended to enhance what's available through transitional housing. So that program's been around since 2019. It started out as an $8 million program. It's now it was expanded in 2022. It's currently a $33.3 million program. And you'll hear later about sort of how counties are using this program, but it really is primarily for transitional housing using that THP Plus program model. The program in the middle, the Housing Navigation and Maintenance Program, is a $13.7 million program. We call it HNMP because there's a lot of words there, right? And it was also established in 2019, but really as a one-time $5 million program, and was then expanded in 2022 for a specific purpose. The original intent of the program was to serve current foster youth who are in sort of highly independent foster care placements and that needed help finding housing. The expansion intention was really to provide counties with funding to serve youth with FUP or FYI vouchers. So now you can sort of see the connection to these programs that we're talking about today. The last program on the screen is called the THP Plus Housing Supplement Program, or THP Plus SUP. We are not going to talk about this program specifically today, but it is included sort of quantitatively in the, the numbers that we cite include, are supported with funding through this program, but we're not going to talk too much about it today. But I wanted to mention it because it is a third component of what HCD offers. And it only goes to 5 counties. And that's why we're not talking about it a lot. And it's really, it was really an attempt to try to help counties increase their monthly rate they pay to providers because the housing costs had increased so much. And so the 5 counties that accept that funding have a requirement that they have to maintain a certain monthly rate that they pay their providers, a minimum rate. So let's jump into sort of the meat of the webinar here, our findings. So this is, I think we sort of shared this in the description of the webinar for the most part, so it might not be a surprise, but it's definitely the biggest finding here is that we've seen an increase in housing capacity for former foster youth, 70% increase between 2021 and 2024. We went from serving 2,179 youth at a moment in time to 3,713 youth. So just to clarify, for the purposes of this report, we're defining supportive housing capacity as including both the THP Plus program and housing choice vouchers available through FYI and FUP. So when we say supportive housing, we're not talking about permanent supportive housing. We're talking about housing coupled with supportive services. So the good news here is that California has surpassed that short-term goal of establishing at least 3,500 housing slots or vouchers for former foster youth. So that's one exciting thing. Another interesting thing, what you can sort of see on the graph there, is that where this increase came from. So you can see the overall increase is 70%, and that consists of 2 programs. One of them grew quicker than the other, right? So when we look at the graph, you see there's a 27% increase in THP Plus capacity since 2021, from 1,309 to 1,664. And then we've more than doubled the number of FYI vouchers from 870 to 2,049. So there's been an exciting increase in vouchers. And we'll talk a little bit about why maybe the increase in transitional housing wasn't higher than this. And we'll talk about that when we go over the findings specific to THP Plus. So a total of 47 or 81% of California's counties have what we're calling supportive housing for former foster youth, either through THP Plus or FYI or FUP vouchers. So of California's 58 counties, a total of 47 offer THP Plus, and then really 33 of those same counties also offer vouchers. So the majority have both. There are 11 counties that have neither THP Plus nor FYI or FUP vouchers. But again, these are counties that have very small foster care populations. So it's not, we're not looking at any counties with, a sizable portion of, a sizable number of young people that are without programs. Okay. So let's look at some regional information here. So as you can see, and this is probably not surprising, the Southern California region has the greatest share of supportive housing capacity in the state, 43% of it. And this makes sense because it is the region with the largest population of young people. And of course, LA County is a huge driver of the population size. I do want to flag that even though Southern California and LA included has the largest population and accounts for the greatest share of housing capacity, that doesn't signal that the region by any means is equipped with enough housing capacity. So I just want to be clear. We're merely stating the fact that they have the largest share. There's in every region, there's definitely need is not met. So every region could use increased housing capacity. So just wanted to make sure that no one jumped to that conclusion. All right, and so now let's look at wait lists. This is something we've looked at a lot in previous years, and I think the good news is we have seen a decline in wait lists. That does tell us that hopefully we're making progress here, right? So a total of 615 youth are on wait lists for THP Plus or an FYI or FUP voucher. That's overall a 19% decline. It's a 21% decline. I think that should actually say 21% on the screen there. In THP Plus wait lists, and an 18% decline in FYI FUP wait lists. And I also want to say, you know, wait lists, I think they are a great indication of need, but we can't put too much sort of weight in our wait lists because, you know, every county and every provider has different wait list policies and practices. So some don't use wait lists at all. Others have different ways of managing their wait lists. And you know, some clear the wait list after some specified period of time if they haven't had contact with the young person, others don't. It's very inconsistent. So I think wait lists are a great proxy, right? So we can see the reduction as progress here, but they in no way indicate the number of youth that are in need of these programs. So I just want to also make that clarification that when we look at these numbers, that doesn't mean, oh, we just need 615 more housing slots. We know that this is just a fraction of the young people that actually need these programs, but it's a great proxy when we compare years to years. All right. So here's another sort of what I think is sort of a big deal. California has the capacity to provide THP Plus or a housing voucher to an estimated 38% of former foster youth who remained in foster care until at least age 18. So let's sort of unpack this a little bit. So right now, there are an estimated 9,871 young adults between ages 21 and 24 who exited foster care in California at age 18 or older, right? So those are folks who were eligible and probably remained in extended foster care, or maybe they exited before they turned 21. But either way, they were in care until at least 18. So there's, you know, nearly 9,900 of them, right? And when you think of like, who are these young people? They are the young people that, while in care, did not achieve what you know the state and federal government define as permanency, right? While in foster care as minors, meaning they didn't exit the foster care system to reunification or guardianship or adoption before they turned 18. That is the population we're sort of looking at when we're doing this analysis. We know that that doesn't cover every young person in need of housing that's been in the foster care system. People come in and out of the system. That can look different for people. And we know that maybe not every single young person who's been in foster care up until age 18 will necessarily access these housing programs or try to access them. But it is a great way of looking at where we are in terms of meeting the need. You know, so to provide THP Plus or a housing voucher to this population, the state would require a total of 9,871 housing slots or vouchers. We currently have 3,713, and that means we require an additional 6,158 housing slots or vouchers to provide housing support to this population. And again, although there are former foster youth seeking housing support who didn't remain in care all the way to age 18, I think it sort of shakes out as a very good estimate because you also have young people, again, that maybe are not going to access these programs from that 9,871. So it's a really good indicator of where we are in terms of really meeting that need. When we think of young people who are exiting the system, you know, they're at an age where they're not earning. When we're 20 years old, 21 years old, we're not earning a ton of money. No one really is, right? And so the likelihood that in many California counties that this population of young people is going to be able to afford housing with zero financial support and without a cosigner and without a family they can go live with, it's just not very realistic. And so we have to really look at both the county level and the state level at what our goals are. Who are we trying to provide housing support for? So here's sort of a scoped out number to consider when we're thinking about these things. So we're going to move away from sort of this overall look at capacity and need, and we're going to drill down a little bit into THP Plus first. So we're going to talk a lot about THP plus rates. So I want to say sort of what we're talking about here. A THP plus rate, a monthly rate, is the amount of funding that's paid by the county to the provider on a monthly basis per youth to operate the program, to provide housing to that young person, right? And so when we look at average rates, we use a weighted rate. We don't just average it all together. We base it on the number of young people in each county and how much that rate is, right? So the average monthly rate, weighted rate per youth that counties pay THP plus providers increased across all three housing models between 21 and 24. So that's a good thing because we know housing costs increased. And so that, and I should say, in most cases, this is counties paying providers. There are, again, a handful of counties that operate the program directly. So this would be the amount it costs for them to operate the program monthly per youth. But in most cases, this is a rate paid to providers. And it's important to understand because it's how these programs stay afloat. You know, THP plus providers are paying rent. They're covering sort of moving costs, all the costs with an apartment turning over. They're paying staff to do the case management and all of the other supportive services. They're providing young people a monthly stipend. They're covering all the overhead and administrative costs associated with running their organization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they have a lot of costs, which means if the monthly THP plus rate's not enough to cover the cost of the program, they're going to operate at a deficit every month. And they're going to have to do a bunch of private fundraising to try to make up that difference and stay afloat. So as you can imagine, the local cost of housing plays a huge factor into what it costs to run these programs. So the average monthly THP plus rate paid per youth increased 29% for the scattered site model. It's now at $3,385. That's the average. 24% for the single site model, and then 65% for the host family model. Prior to 2021, and this is some context, the average rate for the most common housing model, the scattered site rate or scattered site model, had only grown 4% in the prior 10 years. So we're talking about a program where there's no requirement to increase the rate. This is a rate that's negotiated at the local level between the county child welfare agency and the provider. So the increase in available state funding has enabled counties to offer their THP plus providers a rate that more closely aligns with the local costs of providing housing and services to young people. But as you'll hear throughout the webinar, there is still a significant discrepancy in a lot of counties in terms of whether they're being provided enough funding to run these programs. So on that note, the average THP plus rate still trails far behind the foster care rate paid to providers operating what's called THP-NMD, the Transitional Housing Placement for Non-Minor Dependents. So with California's implementation of extended foster care in 2012, new age-appropriate foster care placements became available, and one of the new placements it was actually modeled after the THP plus program is THP-NMD. And this is transitional housing, but it is a foster care placement. And many of the providers that operate THP Plus also operate THP-NMD programs. They look very similar programmatically, but the monthly rates associated with them and sort of the funding associated with them is very different, comes from different places. So THP-NMD has a set statewide rate, a foster care rate that draws on federally, reimbursable foster care funding. And as I said a few minutes ago, THP plus rates are negotiated at the county level. The THP-NMD rate not only is higher at its base, but it's also supplemented based on the local cost of housing according to HUD's fair market rent, and that's called the THP-NMD housing supplement. So statewide, when we look at the base rate for THP-NMD without even applying the additional funding on top that providers receive there, the 2023-24 rate was $4,373 for both the single and what's called remote, which is same as scattered site housing models, and then $3,479 for the host family model, which is pretty much not used in THP-NMD. And that's, again, before any additional funding was provided through the THP-NMD housing supplement. So as you can see on the screen, the base THP-NMD rate is 29% higher than the average, single, scattered site THP plus rate, and 33% higher than the average single site THP plus rate. And then, of course, the disparity is even higher once you add in the local THP NMD housing supplement amounts. So again, let's look at this sort of regionally. So county representatives, folks that we talk to, and providers as well, report, often report that high rental costs and competitive housing markets are really a persistent challenge to operating the program. So, even though housing costs vary greatly across California, a very common sentiment is housing cost. And when you look at all of these regions on the screen, and you look at the increase in their fair market rent between the time period we're looking at, 17 counties experienced a more than 40% increase in fair market rent. So you can sort of see the overall by region, but this is definitely, impacting counties and providers' ability to continue to operate this program. All right, so staying with sort of some regional information, the Bay Area region had the highest average monthly THP plus rate per youth. And the Bay Area region's average single site THP plus rate was $3,899. The average scattered site rate was $3,956. This finding is consistent with the variation in rental costs across California's region. The Bay Area does have the most expensive fair market rent in the state, but I do want to say, similar to kind of the other regional breakdown we looked at on capacity, just because the Bay Area is the most expensive region and has the highest rate doesn't mean the rate is sufficient. It just means it is higher than the other regions, right? All right. So what about parenting youth, right? We do have young people that are custodial parents in these programs. We ask counties whether they offered a higher monthly rate for on behalf of young people that are pregnant or parenting. And this is significant because custodial parents require larger housing accommodations. They're also serving young people that are, they're serving a family versus serving just that young person. That requires additional staff time. And, so 7 counties have set their monthly THP plus rates at higher amounts for parenting youth. You can sort of see from the screen that the 5 out of 7 of them are in the Bay. And that's Alameda, San Francisco, San Mateo, Santa Clara, and Sonoma. And then the other 2 are LA and Sacramento in other regions. And the average monthly rate paid to serve parenting youth in these counties is $4,230. And, the good news here is that this is an increase. It is in the positive direction. Previously, back in the day, there was just 1 or 2 counties with a parenting rate. Then more recently, I want to say there was 5 in 2021, and now we're at 7. And I think this is, it's an important thing to consider when you're thinking about the budget for your program. Okay, so we are now going to move off of THP Plus and talk about FUP and FYI vouchers more specifically. Okay, so we'll start with something very obvious here, but we wanted to include it as a finding because I think sometimes important things are right in front of our face and we don't always pay attention. But the increase in the number of FYI or FUP vouchers awarded to public housing authorities in California has more than doubled the amount of federal housing assistance California public housing authorities receive for this program. When a housing authority is awarded a voucher, they're awarded funding from HUD. And the more vouchers housing authorities in our state apply for and receive, the more federal housing assistance people in our state benefit from. This is key during a time when our state funding is more limited. We are coming out of a couple years of deficits. We did have a modest surplus this year that I think is, dwindling with some of the crises we're seeing across the state right now. And we don't have a great budget outlook in the short term, it sounds like. And so it's important that we look to what we are missing at the federal level and really maximize what we're drawing down here. And so in 2021, when California had approximately 870 FYI FUP vouchers, housing authorities were collectively receiving about an estimated 14.1 million from HUD. With the increase, we're now looking at more like 33.3 million for these programs. All right. So as you recall, FYI and FUP require a partnership between housing authorities and county child welfare. So, how many are partnering? What are we looking at here? So nearly half, so 47% of California's housing authorities, and we have 97 of them, administer FUP and or FYI vouchers in partnership with just over half, so 53% of California's 58 counties. One little caveat, during the time we administered the survey, informing the report, both Alameda and Los Angeles were in the process of securing partnerships with additional housing authorities, but agreements hadn't been fully executed and vouchers hadn't yet been requested. And so just so we, are clear here, we're even further along than we see here, than we see in the voucher numbers, because really voucher information about vouchers is a regularly changing figure. It's not like THP Plus where there is a set contract and then that's it for a year or two. With vouchers, you can request them on that rolling basis, and you can execute new MOUs with new housing authorities at any point. So this is a number that is changing and harder to stay on top of. But what we're sharing today is as of obviously last October. So more than half, so 56% of California's partnering housing authorities utilize the non-competitive FYI on-demand voucher request process. And again, this is the process that allows housing authorities to request those vouchers on a rolling basis throughout the fiscal year. As you can see, 6 or 18% of the reported housing authorities use the non-competitive request process as well as the traditional competitive process. Excuse me. And 13 or 38% use only the non-competitive process, that on-demand process, and then 15 or 44% use the competitive process for requesting vouchers. So this, again, this might not seem that significant. This might not seem like a big aha, but it's an increase from 2021 when almost no housing authorities were using the on-demand request process. I'll say awareness about this process has boomed in the past several years, thanks to a lot of stakeholders across the state that have really, made it their business to spread the word about this. And really it's, this was a process established in federal policy so that we could prevent young people from experiencing homelessness before it even happens, right? So we can anticipate their exit from the foster care system or their exit from a housing program and say, we need a voucher for them before this, becomes an unstable situation. And so that is really the goal and the purpose of that request process. And so it's great to see that that housing authorities in several counties now are using it. All right. So nearly 1/4 or 23% of counties have reported having limited the number of FYI or FUP vouchers provided in partnership with their housing authority at some point due to insufficient service provision capacity. So we asked in the survey if we asked county representatives if their agency had ever had to limit the number of vouchers being provided in partnership with their housing authority because they didn't have enough capacity to provide those supportive services. And the reason we asked about this is because this has been a huge point of discussion in the community of practice we just led on FYI and subsequent technical assistance we've provided since then. It comes up frequently. People want to meet the need, they want to serve more young people, but you can't just throw a voucher out into the world and expect it to stick, right? Expect that voucher to turn into housing without support. And it's also required by HUD that we offer that support, right? So counties really need to have the capacity to offer what's required of their side of the partnership. So representatives in 23 counties indicated they had limited vouchers due to insufficient service provision capacity. And I'll just say that, we'll talk about this in a minute, but, beyond fulfilling that federal mandate, programs really report, people that run these programs are really reporting just that these supportive services are crucial to getting young people to lease up successfully. And the Housing Navigation and Maintenance Program, it provides an ongoing source of funding to serve youth, for this purpose. But it's not going to meet full demand. So other funding sources that counties are, drawing on are extremely limited. They're not ongoing, or they're not available in their county. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but counties are sort of really trying to get creative here to figure out how to increase their service provision capacity. So, you know, counties, County Child Welfare Agency representatives reported that identifying and securing housing with an FYI or FUP voucher continues to be one of the most significant challenges associated with the program. We've heard this from housing authorities, we've heard this from counties, we've heard this from providers, we've heard this from young people. Even though denying a unit to a tenant with the housing choice voucher isn't legal in California, it doesn't mean that getting a unit is easy, right? Identifying landlords that'll rent to youth that hold vouchers is difficult. Young adults can face, discrimination. Sometimes landlords, they don't want a time limited subsidy. This is a time limited subsidy. Sheer age can be a source of sensitivity, right? Or a lack of credit history, lack of rental history. There's a number of reasons why it's hard to lease up with a voucher. Additionally, not all units meet, satisfactory standards, right? They have to pass a health and safety inspection. They have to meet the unit, the rent threshold, has to be within an eligible range. So there's a lot of reasons that this is a challenging program, but there are solutions there, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But I don't want to brush over challenges of the program here. Okay. This is our last finding section. It is talking about the money now, right? So this all takes money, all takes funding, and we need to understand how that works. So our first finding here is the majority of counties, so 83%, are utilizing their transitional housing program funding to serve youth using the THP Plus program model. 17% are using the funding for other interventions. So I mentioned earlier today, or earlier in the presentation, that the transitional housing program was really envisioned to be a way to expand local THP Plus programs, but it's actually very flexible funding. So while it's intended for that purpose, most counties are using it for that purpose, it's flexible. So if you're in a county that doesn't have a THP Plus program, for example, and doesn't have a high enough allocation amount from the state to start a program, there's other things you can do. You can assist youth with moving costs. You can provide housing navigation. You could provide case management. So just provide the services. You can provide just emergency shelter, permanent supportive housing, even if you have existing programs that you want to add that funding to. So there are other things that that counties are doing that are not using this for THP Plus. And in some cases, they're using, a chunk of it for THP Plus, and then the balance for to supplement other, services. Okay. So similarly, so nearly all 96% of counties with FYI or FUP vouchers use the Housing Navigation and Maintenance Program, or HNMP, to serve voucher recipients. So we asked this sort of similar question about the Housing Navigation and Maintenance Program, but related to vouchers, right? We asked, how are you using this funding? Are you using it to serve youth with vouchers? Or are you using it for other populations? What are you doing? And so nearly all counties reported they are using HNMP to serve youth with vouchers. So I mentioned earlier just that, counties really have to piece together, right, different funding sources, because Housing Navigation and Maintenance Program doesn't stretch far enough often. So we wanted to know, what other funding sources are you tapping into, and how's that working for you? And so here's the full range of what people have reported, but with a lot of caveats of, well, I can only use a little bit of this, or we can only use this year. So there's 67% reported having to piece together funding from 3 or more sources, right, to try to meet the need of all the young people that have vouchers, not even the young people that don't have vouchers yet, but just for the young people that have vouchers. And so we've got CalAIM, right, which is really using Medi-Cal funding for some of the newer ways that you can use it. There's other county behavioral health funding, and other just community case management. some of the challenges here are, with other like outside sort of non-child welfare funding is it's often used for other purposes, right? So you're not able to often get a significant portion of that funding or tap into it for this purpose. With CalAIM, I think it's really promising, but we do know that it's not going to provide the full spectrum of services that are needed. But tapping into it for what it can be tapped into is really important, and I think a key thing to look to for the future. On the right-hand side, we've got transitional housing programs. So if you have a little bit of leftover transitional housing program funding, you could move some of that over to assisting youth with vouchers. You could reduce the number of youth you're providing transitional housing to and use more of that to support youth with vouchers because it's more cost effective overall for the county. The independent living program, I think, was envisioned at the federal level as being available to serve youth with FYI or FUP vouchers, but we are so underfunded with ILP that that's almost laughable. You can use, ILP for serving, for actually providing housing, but it's pretty rare. There's a 30% cap on that, but you could use it obviously for the services. HAP, the Homeless Housing Assistance and Prevention Program, that's one-time funding. So it's fortunately been funded consistently for the last several years, but it is no guarantee that it will continue. And it's, it's often used for other priorities to address youth homelessness in communities across the state. And then the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, YHDP, is only available in, I want to say, 12 counties in California. And again, it's often prioritized for other purposes that are specified in a community's coordinated community plan, which is required by YHDP. So these are not going to always meet the need, but they're what counties are drawing on to try to serve as many young people as possible. All right. So the proposed elimination of the Housing Navigation and Maintenance Program in the 24-25 state budget resulted in service disruption. I'm sure many of you on the webinar recall last year we got some bad news in January, and we heard that HNMP was on the chopping block in the governor's budget because we had a deficit. And so the good news is we came out in the end with the funding preserved, but it had a cooling effect, It's the first 6 months of 2024 were pretty scary, I think, for people, for young people themselves, obviously, for the providers serving them, for the county serving them, a lot of uncertainty. This funding's relied upon to serve young people, and so kind of in fear that counties would no longer have these resources potentially to provide those services. The proposed cut really had this cooling effect where some counties delayed executing contracts to wait to see what happened with the funding. Or even I heard some people rescinded job offers, what they were trying to ramp up. We had people not, pausing the release of vouchers, not requesting future vouchers. So it was really a little scary on a lot of levels. And again, fortunately, we came out with a good outcome, but those temporary, pauses, they do impact young people and their ability to be housed. So we definitely saw that proposed elimination gave us a window into what it would look like without this funding. So fluctuations in funding allocation levels for both the transitional housing program and the housing navigation and maintenance program definitely present challenges to program operations. They're both formula funded, funding sources. And, they're based on data that shifts from year to year. So county representatives reported that shifting in allocation amounts makes operating an ongoing program really challenging, right? Increases or decreases in the funding impacts the number of youth that can be served, the staffing capacity, local contracts, and counties and providers, they need to be able to predict if funds are going to actually cover the contracted amount. All right. So that took us through our findings. I'm going to start gathering all of our questions and getting ready for our exciting Q&A while Debbie starts presenting on some of these recommendations. So she's going to share information about our state recommendations here.
All right. Thank you so much, Simone. Such great information. And I am excited to be able to talk about, so what's next? What do we think should be done to strengthen the ecosystem for our transitional age youth even more? So if we can go to the next slide, thank you. So the first recommendation that we have based on the findings is that the state should look at increasing its investment in these housing programs to provide housing support for all youth exiting extended foster care. So we know, Simone shared, that there's been a 70% increase in supportive housing, which is amazing. However, there still is substantial need if we were to address the housing needs of all youth between the ages of 21 and 24 who remained in foster care until at least age 18, the state would require another 6,165 housing slots. So even though we might not be able to get to that full number in the immediate future, it's certainly something that we recommend the state be striving towards. And I'll just reiterate a point that Simone made as well, which is to not over rely on the number of youth on wait lists to think about what the need is. So we found that there are 615 youth on wait lists. However, these wait lists don't necessarily fully reflect the extent of the need due to variations in different waitlist policies and practices across different counties. But the fact that there are 615 youth on wait lists certainly signals that we need additional funding to be able to expand the number of housing slots available even further. So if we can go to the next slide. So the next recommendation is to ensure the preservation of these programs. So Simone talked about right here at the end, these programs, of course, have been instrumental in this 70% increase in housing capacity that we've seen. And these programs continue to be critical to the continued availability of housing navigation, supportive services, and actual housing subsidies themselves. So as Simone mentioned, the proposed elimination of HNMP in last year's state budget really provided a very scary preview of what would happen if this program was cut. We know the county representatives reported pausing the release of vouchers, reducing or suspending services, or scaling back expansion plans that were underway. So we need to ensure the stability of these programs moving forward. If we can go to the next slide. So our third recommendation for the state is related to data collection. So we recommend that the state establish a requirement that county child welfare agencies collect and report annual data on the utilization of FYI and FUP vouchers for former foster youth. So there's no publicly available data, unfortunately, for the utilization of these vouchers by youth. There is a dashboard at the federal level that's run by HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is a housing choice voucher data dashboard, which shows a number of different housing choice voucher programs. And it does provide a lot of robust information about budget, leasing trends, reserve balances, program admissions, and then attrition, the per unit costs, and those types of things. And it does actually allow a drill down to the state level and even to the level of housing authority. The problem with that dashboard is that for FUP vouchers are available to both youth and families. And the vouchers are not disaggregated on that dashboard between youth and families. And so there's no way for us, unfortunately, to know how many of those vouchers are being utilized for youth. And FYI is kind of subsumed as a subcategory within FUP. And so there's no way to break out that number either. So we really don't have access to any data about the utilization of FYI and FUP vouchers. So there's no requirement currently that county child welfare agencies or housing authorities report their participation levels in these programs. The county child welfare agencies do submit data to HCD on the utilization of the transitional housing program and HNMP funds, but that data submission at this point does not require that they also provide information about how many vouchers are being used. So in order, if we really want to be able to assess whether the state is making progress in expanding housing resources for former foster youth, this kind of regularly available public information is going to be crucial. So if we can go to the next slide. So number 4 in our recommendations to the state of California is that the state provide guidance to county child welfare agencies and public housing authorities about their participation in FYI and FUP and how they can expand that participation. So these programs, the FYI and FUP voucher programs, are federal programs implemented at the local level. So the state doesn't necessarily have a formal role in that. However, the state is still very well positioned to be able to influence local participation in these programs. So the California Department of Social Services, HCD, Department of Housing and Community Development, as well as the Interagency Council on Homelessness, are all state agencies that could play a role in issuing guidance to both encourage participation in these programs and outline some of the best practices that are out there and really encourage adoption of those best practices so that we're leveraging these programs to the maximum extent available. Okay, on to number 5. So our next recommendation is to stabilize the funding allocations for the programs operated by HCD. So again, the Transitional Housing Program and HNMP. So these are both formula funded programs administered by HCD, which means that the amount of money that counties receive from these programs is based on that county's share of the specified subpopulation. However, the number of youth who meet eligibility for these programs shift year to year. And so that means that the amount of the allocation also shifts year to year as population numbers change. So this can be very disruptive for a county. It makes it very hard to predict what the amount of funding is that's going to be available, and then how to staff it, what the activities should be, etc. So the programs could be more stable and predictable if there was an expectation that the funding amounts were not going to change significantly from year to year. So in order to do that, there's a couple different strategies that could be used. One would be to limit the amount of increases or decreases to the allocation size year to year by a designated percentage. So in other words, kind of regardless of how the population numbers change, there's a guarantee that the allocation amount doesn't change by more than X percent, 10%, 15%, whatever the number is. Another way to proceed with this would be to look at changing the funding formula so that it's based on less variable data, so that there's some other mechanism that's used to determine how much money each county gets that doesn't shift so much year to year. Okay, if we could go to the next slide. Our next recommendation is for the state to consider strategies to mitigate the impact of inflation and in particular rising housing costs on ongoing programs that are funded at a fixed level. So unfortunately, these programs have a set allocation amount that doesn't change year to year unless the state in the budgeting process decides to give the program an increase. And so what we saw in the survey results was that while the Transitional Housing Program was expanded from $8 million in 2022 all the way up to $33.3 million, 100% of that money was not able to go to increasing the number of slots because some of this money ended up being used to increase the monthly rates paid to THP Plus providers, because those providers, as Simone talked about, were having to subsidize these programs at a higher and higher level each year through other sources because the amount that they were getting was being chipped away at by the fact that housing prices were rising and their allocations were not rising by a comparable amount. So before the program's expansion, many providers were paid significantly less than the actual cost of administering THP Plus. And so the recommendation here is to mirror how funding is looked at through the child welfare system, where there's an automatic increase that happens every year based on the California Necessities Index, which is one of the measures of inflation that allows foster care rates to keep pace with the rate of inflation. And something similar could be built into the THP Plus program. And then the last state recommendation before I turn it back over to Simone. So if we can go to the next slide. Is to establish funding for capital development for both interim and permanent housing for youth. So the programs that we've been talking about today subsidize the cost of housing on the private market or through different strategies. However, it doesn't actually expand the number of units that exist in the housing ecosystem. And so one of the biggest barriers to successful implementation of these programs, whether it be finding housing with an FYI voucher or finding housing through a THP Plus program, is the high cost of housing and the limited availability of housing, which of course is sadly exacerbated by the tragic fires in LA. So as housing prices have risen, the cost and scarcity of viable housing units really constrain the expansion of these programs. So one strategy to address this is to actually build housing. So that's what we mean when we say capital development, is funding for the actual development of housing that is specifically targeted for transition age former foster youth. What we do see is that while building more housing is always a good thing, building more housing that is actually targeted to this population really ensures that these young people have access to places to live. So just as an example, the Home Key program, Project Home Key, which is another project that's administered by HCD, is a project that has over the last few years awarded funding to local public entities to build more interim and permanent housing. In the second and third rounds of Home Key, there was a youth set aside that was created. So 8% of the total funds were actually earmarked specifically to create housing for youth and young adults. This youth set aside resulted in 40 new projects that will create eventually 929 new units specifically for youth, some of which are being utilized to house participants who are in either THP Plus or have FYI or vouchers. So additional investment in Home Key or similar programs with that youth set aside is a recommendation that we have to address the housing needs of this population. So that concludes our state recommendations. We do have some recommendations for counties as well. If we can move to the next slide, I'm going to turn it back over to Simone, who's going to walk you through the recommendations we have for county child welfare agencies.
Thanks, Debbie. And take this is our last little stretch. So feel free to take a moment and put, if you have a question to put in the chat or in the questions box, excuse me, please do. All right. So county child welfare agencies. So our first one, sorry, I'm closing things on my screen here. Our first one is counties with large foster care populations should leverage master rental subsidy agreements to secure rental units for youth with FYI or vouchers. And so just an MRSA, master rental subsidy agreement, is an agreement between a property owner and a public agency or a provider that allows the agency or the provider to cover part or all of the rent for individual leases, but doesn't require a master lease. So, in transitional housing, master leasing is really common, but not for vouchers because the lease is in the young person's name. So it allows you to do something similar, where you're guaranteeing the landlord will receive these rental subsidies, they'll receive their rent. And in in exchange, they're saying, I will put these units aside for you. So, and I should say a critical part of this is that the agency or the provider typically offers incentives to the property owner, right? So we've talked about landlord incentives, a lot in our sort of best practices documents related to FYI. But this is a critical part, right? Is how do we secure these units? And so there's a range of landlord incentives that can be offered. But it really, the goal is to, mitigate any anticipated impact or impact of renting the units to the tenants that you're renting to. It's a good strategy. The master rental subsidy agreement is a good strategy for larger communities, in particular because it really enables you to scale up housing availability in bulk, essentially. So just as an example, one of the largest MRSA projects to date is operated by Brilliant Corners in Los Angeles through what they call the Flexible Housing Subsidy Pool. And that's helped over nearly 14,000 residents across LA County, not young people specifically, but overall, secure housing. And so it's something to think about for young people that are particularly for these larger communities. All right. So establish regional transitional housing programs to meet the needs of youth in small rural counties. So we talked a little about bigger counties and how do we, cut the housing time for bigger counties, the housing search time, how do we guarantee units, how do we scale up? So that's sort of an issue in larger counties. In smaller counties, often the funding allocation is so small that they can't establish a transitional housing program with it, right? So a total of 11 counties don't have THP Plus programs, although the majority of them are still provided the opportunity to accept transitional housing program funding from HCD. So, some of the folks we talked to in the smaller counties expressed interest in offering a more kind of formal program model like THP Plus. But, again, they just don't quite have enough funds to do that. And so instead they're offering, like covering one-time costs, rental, move-in costs, things like that, which is great and super helpful. But if you want to offer something that's a more intensive intervention, that's challenging. So one option would be to really, collaborate regionally. You could have a provider that operates across multiple counties in a region and sort of have them running one program that serves multiple counties, and you get to pool your funding. All right. Incorporate landlord incentives into the budget for any service provider contracts related to scattered site transitional housing or housing navigation for youth with FYI vouchers. So again, kind of coming back to this landlord incentive piece, it is really hard, particularly in a high cost county and a competitive housing market, to have a successful voucher program where young people are successfully leasing up without landlord incentives, right? And it's often hard for transitional housing providers to secure units without landlord incentives. So this could be signing bonuses, vacancy funds, higher security deposits, damage mitigation funds are a big thing. So these are just things to think about as you're building out your budget. And we're trying not to get too into sort of the practice side of things, because this is really a policy level webinar. But these are a couple things that we've also included in our sort of our best practices guide for FYI. But we see them as, these are local county policy decisions. And it's important to think about these things when you're building out your budget. All right. Provide a higher monthly THP Plus rate for pregnant and parenting youth. So like we talked about earlier, pregnant and parenting youth in THP Plus require additional support in case management. They require living arrangements with more space. Ideally, maybe not a shared space. Some programs find a way of making that work well for young people who are parenting. Many opt to provide a private apartment that is not shared with another program participant. In California, approximately 32% of 21-year-old former foster youth and 41.7% of 23-year-old former foster youth are parents of young children. So, and about 80% of these young people have custody of their children. So, you know, as youth get older, they're more likely to have children. That is just something that's, that's life. And so we really need to plan for that in these programs. And, offering a higher monthly rate in order to make sure that providers are able to offer what needs to be offered to young people who are parenting is important. And it's also important because you want providers to be able to serve young people who are parenting. You don't want providers to say, we can only afford to serve, X number of parenting youth at one time because our budget. We don't want to see that happen. All right. Use Medi-Cal to fund supportive services for youth with FY or FUP vouchers. So we're really talking about, again, talking about CalAIM here, right? The California's made significant changes to its Medi-Cal program. CalAIM is California Advancing and Innovating Medi-Cal Initiative, and it expanded the allowable services that Medi-Cal can fund. So new opportunities under CalAIM include enhanced case management provided through managed care organizations. So these could be a provider that contracts with a managed care plan, and managed care organizations can provide a whole array of services. They're called community supports. It can be housing navigation, housing tenancy and sustaining services, housing deposits. So all of these things can now be funded through Medi-Cal for youth on managed care plans. And some communities are leveraging these benefits in a really coordinated way as part of the sort of service component for FYI FUP vouchers. So as counties sort of explore what's happening with CalAIM and their, locally, it would be good to think about getting some of your providers that you work with that work with young people, get a contract with a managed care plan and be able to offer those services. And if you joined us back last September for our best practices webinar on FYI, you heard Stephanie Sandmeyer from Sacramento talk about how they're working with providers who are contracted managed care organizations to offer services to youth with FYI FUP vouchers. So if you're interested to learn more about that, check out that webinar. All right, it's 10:45. I'm going to ask, turn it over to Debbie to help to moderate all the questions that we've received. And if you have questions at a later date, you're welcome to email me or Valerie, who worked on this report, and we're happy to answer your questions at a later date.
All right, thanks, Simone. So we have a lot of questions, so we're going to do our best to get through as many as we can. Thank you to everyone who sent questions in. So the first one, Simone, is when the 5 years are up for an FYI voucher, do they return to a normal Section 8 voucher?
That's a great question. And you're also, whoever sent this in is sort of setting us up to make a plug for a really great local policy for a county or for a housing authority. So the FYI voucher, it can extend, like you're mentioning, to 5 years. But after that, there is no guarantee of anything, right? If you are in a county or with a housing authority that has this on their radar and has taken some formal action, there are options, but there is no guarantee. So what some counties are doing is they are saying, we are going to set a wait list preference for our normal housing choice vouchers, our permanent housing, they're not time limited housing choice vouchers. And when the 5 years is up, we are going to offer every young person who has an expired voucher a permanent housing choice voucher. But again, that is not happening in the majority of communities, frankly. But it is something that is an option, and we definitely encourage housing authorities to adopt that.
Right. So the next question is about eligibility. What is eligibility for these programs for former foster youth?
Sure. So for THP Plus, and so I'll start here. Both programs are between ages 18 and 24, meaning have not yet turned 25. THP Plus, there's an additional requirement that you had to have been in care on or after your 18th birthday. And then you have to be working toward the goals in your TILP. There are no work or education requirements. Some of those are goals in the TILP, so maybe that's part of working toward the goals in your TILP, but there are no hard and fast education or employment requirements. And you can be in the program for up to 36 months. For vouchers, same age range. The key thing to know is that you have to execute that housing assistance payment contract before turning 25, or you lose the opportunity to get the voucher. The nice thing, though, is that you can execute that plan at the age of 24. You can keep that voucher still for that 3 to 5 years. So you can be well into your, late 20s even sometimes with a voucher if you keep it for that full duration, as long as you get it before you're 25. And the eligibility in terms of like foster care threshold for FYI FUP is now, it has shifted from previous years. It is now very open. So however, just you have to have been in foster care or out of home probation placement. There is no like you had to have been in it after a certain date. Many counties do operationalize the definition as on or after age 16 to have been in care because that was the previous federal requirement, but that is not a requirement now. So counties could choose to say you were in care as a 10-year-old for 2 years, and we are going to offer you a voucher because you're now in need of a voucher. It's really up to the county child welfare agency to verify that eligibility. And once that happens, that's not, questioned or audited by like HUD or the housing authority saying, are you sure this person's eligible? So it's really about identifying your parameters and then providing that verification that that young person was in foster care at some point.
Right, thank you. So we've had several questions come in. I'm going to combine them that are asking you, Simone, to look into your crystal ball and share your thoughts on whether there's any possibility of these programs getting cut under the new federal administration.
Sure. I think there's a lot of potential things that have already been, I think, cut, under with executive order under the federal our new administration. But I don't foresee these specific programs being at risk. I think what these programs are subject to is state budget appropriation. So our state's budget, is big. These programs are a fraction of that budget. And so if the state budget has a deficit, any program that is subject to budget appropriation is technically at risk. But we, I think, came forward with a pretty strong defense this last year. And I don't foresee in the near future that we're at risk of that. And I don't think, I don't think that our state using more of its budget to make up for whatever we're losing federally places these programs at direct risk. Now, again, I can't look into a crystal ball, but I'm more worried about other issues, of course, frankly, other impacts of our new administration than these programs.
All right, thank you. So the next question is there any guidance for transitioning youth to or chaining funding available through CalAIM housing programs?
Yes. So there's a great there's a great document that provides guidance for providers. CalAIM is really living in terms of who goes and gets it and pursues it. It really lives with providers. So you go and get contracted with a managed care plan. It doesn't go through like the county child welfare agency, right? They are just a local stakeholder, right? Relevant party, but they're not involved in that process. It's really the provider going and pursuing it. I'm going to put this in the chat. I'm going to put this guide that Children's Trust came out with that really helps providers weigh, like, are you considering becoming a CalAIM provider? Here are some things to weigh, and I'm putting that in the chat so folks can look at it at a later date. But I would say that that's something to look to when you're thinking about whether to get into that area of work.
Thank you. Okay, who do we contact to have our youth apply for FYI or FUP?
Great question. So we all know now, right? We've all talked about that this goes through the housing authority. The voucher goes through the housing authority. But the point of contact for a young person or for someone assisting a young person is not the housing authority. It's really the county child welfare agency. That is who does the kind of referral to the housing authority and who verifies eligibility. And so I'm going to put a roster in the chat that lists by county all of the point of contacts for county child welfare if you'd like to ask for a voucher. It also has the housing authority, and if there's a contracted service provider, it has all of that information on the roster, but the point of contact is indicated for the county child welfare, so you can find out if this is available in your county. And if the person says we don't have vouchers left, you can say, well, could you request me an on-demand voucher, right? Because that is an option. And so it's not always an option in every county. They could have maxed out their requests with their housing authority, or they could be put on hold for making further requests at the moment. So I don't want to mislead people to think it's a free-for-all. It's not, but it very well might be an option. And it's definitely an option in many communities.
And I'll just say that for the information that's being provided in the chat, if you're not able to copy it from the chat, don't worry about it. We're going to include all of the links that Simone is providing in a follow-up email. So don't stress out if you're missing stuff that's going in the chat. You will get it via email. Okay, so the next question is, the question was, which counties in California are most successful at maximizing FYI and FUP? And I'll just add to that, and are there any resources available to help support counties?
Yes, yes. So there's definitely a lot of cool things happening across different counties. I said we just led a community of practice of 15 counties in 2023 that we ended last year, and learned a ton about what counties are doing and talked a lot about that. I'm going to put the webinar and the report that we did, that is our FYI best practices guide, the stemming from that community of practice, also in the chat. And I'll just say that on the webinar, there were a number of panelists that presented from counties and housing authorities that shared some of their best practices. So to answer your question about like, where is this going well? It's not limited to those counties. There's a lot of folks doing a lot of great things, but some good people to look to for ideas would be on that webinar that I just put in the chat.
All right. So the next question is, can a youth who is a ward of a California county court but who lives out of state utilize THPP?
So THP Plus, which I assume what you're referring to, not THP NMD. THP Plus is a California program. So I'm just going to cover a few things because I want to make sure. Oh, yeah, ward of California County. Yeah, so if you were in care in California, that's one thing. The issue is you'd have to be placed somewhere where the provider could actually serve you. So if you're placed out of state, that provider can't do that case management. So it's really not for young people who live out of state. If you're in foster care and you get an out-of-state placement, that's something entirely different. So I want to make sure I'm answering, for THP Plus, for youth who have left care, that is usually not an option, is to be placed out of state through THP Plus.
Got it. Thank you. So there's two questions related to host families, that host family model that you described for THP Plus. First is, what is it? And then second is the rate of $18.88 paid directly to youth for rent in the host home.
So a host home, it's similar to a foster home, right? It's a family that is welcoming and saying, come live here, right? They're hosting that young person in their home, but it's different in the relationship because it's not a parent. It's more of a mentor relationship. And you're a young adult, so you're living in a home with a family that's saying, we'll support you at the developmental stage that you're in. So, and you think of like foreign exchange students that have a host family in another country, they're hosting that young person temporarily in their home. The sort of same definition, right? The payment the way that the rate works is a portion goes to the host family to cover, the cost of having that young person live with them, sort of essentially like rent a room, right? And then the young person also receives a monthly stipend, but those are two different amounts that are provided to the family and the young person.
Great. Can you say a little bit more about when you talked about insufficient service provision? Did you mean that there's not enough staff to provide the support? And how does the county know if their county falls into that category?
Yeah, so you would know because if you have a certain number of vouchers, and you say you have 25 vouchers, and so you need enough support to provide services upfront, housing navigation services, then ongoing services to 25 young people. That's going to require a certain amount of, yes, people power, staffing, and just, is there a program, an entity that can serve them, right? And so when a county says they have limited service capacity, they're basically saying, we don't have any more budget to pay any more program to grow, right? So we can only have enough money to afford, 2 case managers, and that's not enough for the number of youth we have. We need 4. So it's about staffing, but it's really about the programmatic infrastructure, like who's providing these services. The county doesn't have to pay for it if they can find a program in the community that's operating and it says, we have existing funding, we can provide case management or whatnot, right? That's great, but in a lot of cases, that's not happening, right? And so counties are having to really identify funding that they're responsible for, that they are putting forth to make sure those services happen. And so it's really at the funding level where the capacity lacks that translates into not having enough program, not having enough people to provide services.
Great. And I'm going to take the liberty to answer a couple of questions myself that came in that are actually kind of related to housing for students. So the first is whether foster youth get priority access for student housing at community colleges. There's a lot of new housing being built at community colleges. And the answer, unfortunately, is no. Community colleges are not required to give foster youth priority. However, JBay is sponsoring a bill this year in order to change that, to ensure that foster youth can get priority access to any housing, either existing or newly created at community colleges. So stay tuned, make sure that you're signed up for our newsletter to get updates on that bill once it gets introduced. There's also a question about whether the Higher Education Student Housing Grant Program will continue to be funded. As far as I know, yes. I am not aware of any new money that's being proposed for that program, but there is still a lot of the existing money that's rolling out. So I don't anticipate that money that's already been allocated will be clawed back or anything. But of course, I don't have a crystal ball either. So who knows what the future will hold. But yes, that, student housing is definitely, there's been some creative collaboration between THP Plus programs and colleges to be able to enable students to access housing through their campuses. So we're at time, unless I don't know if there's, one last urgent question you want to answer, Simone. Otherwise, I think we're going to wrap it up.
No, I just want to say that if your question didn't get answered, because I know there's a lot that we didn't quite get to, feel free to email me at a later date and we will get them answered. Some people ask for some resources and things. Please do reach out and we'll get that to you. And thank you so much for attending.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good rest of the week.